Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she finished cleaning the officers' mess hall for the third time that week. The smell of bleach mixed with the lingering aroma of coffee and fried food filled her nostrils. At 24, she had been working as a civilian contractor at Fort Richardson for almost 2 years, taking care of cleaning duties across the massive military base. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and helped her save money for nursing school. She had always dreamed of becoming a nurse, just like her grandmother who had served in Vietnam. Her grandmother's stories about helping wounded soldiers had inspired Sarah from a young age. Every dollar she earned cleaning floors and scrubbing toilets brought her one step closer to that dream. She kept a small notebook in her back pocket where she tracked her savings progress, marking off each milestone with a red pen. The base was huge, stretching across thousands of acres in Alaska. Sarah knew every building, every hallway, and every corner. She took pride in her work, even when others looked down on her. Some of the younger soldiers would make jokes about the cleaning lady, but most treated her with respect. She had become friends with many of the enlisted personnel who appreciated her kind nature and hard work. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison was different from the others. He had arrived at the base 6 months ago with an attitude that rubbed everyone the wrong way. Morrison came from a wealthy family and had attended an expensive military academy. He looked down on anyone he considered beneath his social status. He was particularly cruel to the civilian contractors, treating them like servants rather than valued members of the base community. Sarah first encountered Morrison's nastiness during her second week of work. She had accidentally bumped into him while carrying a bucket of soapy water, splashing a few drops on his perfectly polished boots. Instead of accepting her sincere apology, Morrison had screamed at her in front of a dozen soldiers, calling her clumsy and worthless. The incident left Sarah shaken, but she tried to avoid him whenever possible. Morrison's behavior wasn't limited to Sarah. He treated all the civilian workers poorly, often making them redo tasks that were already completed perfectly. He would inspect their work with a magnifying glass, looking for any excuse to criticize. The other officers on base noticed his behavior, but seemed reluctant to confront someone of his rank and family connections. What Morrison didn't know was that Sarah came from a military family herself. Her father had been a decorated sergeant who died in Afghanistan when she was 16. Her mother struggled to raise 3 children alone on a small military pension. Sarah's decision to work at the base wasn't just about the money, it was her way of staying connected to her father's memory and the military community that had meant so much to him. Sarah kept a small photograph of her father in his dress uniform tucked inside her cleaning cart. Sometimes during her lunch breaks, she would sit in the chapel and look at the picture, telling him about her day and her progress toward nursing school. She felt his presence strongest when she was on the base, surrounded by the sounds and sights that he had loved. The base commander, Colonel Patricia Williams, had noticed the excellent condition of all the facilities. Everything was spotless from the barracks to the administrative buildings. She had been particularly impressed with the attention to detail in the officers' quarters and mess facilities. Williams made it a point to recognize good work, regardless of someone's position or rank. During one of her routine inspections, Williams encountered Sarah scrubbing graffiti off a bathroom wall. Instead of walking past, the colonel stopped to talk. Sarah was nervous at first, unsure why such a high-ranking officer would want to speak with her. Williams asked about her background and was impressed to learn about Sarah's father's service and her own goals for the future. Williams had worked her way up through the ranks. Over 20 years of service, she understood the value of hard work and dedication, having faced her own challenges as a woman in the military. She recognized something special in Sarah, a determination and character that reminded her of the best soldiers she had known throughout her career. The colonel began making subtle inquiries about Sarah's work, performance, and how she was treated by the base personnel. Most of the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. Soldiers praised her professionalism and kindness. However, Williams also heard whispers about Morrison's harsh treatment of the civilian contractors, particularly one young woman who worked in cleaning services. Morrison's family connections had always protected him from consequences. His father was a retired general with political influence, and his uncle served on several important military committees. Morrison had learned early in life that his last name could open doors and shield him from accountability. He used this knowledge to his advantage, often pushing boundaries that other officers wouldn't dare cross. Sarah continued her work diligently, focusing on her savings goal and trying to stay positive despite Morrison's occasional outbursts. She had developed a thick skin over the months, learning to deflect his insults and focus on the bigger picture. Her co-workers in the cleaning crew looked up to her as an unofficial leader, and she made sure to support them when they faced difficulties. The base operated like a small city, with thousands of personnel working together to maintain readiness and security. Sarah had become an invisible but essential part of this community. She knew which soldiers were homesick, which officers were under stress, and which areas needed extra attention. Her presence brought a sense of warmth and humanity to the cold military environment. As winter approached in Alaska, the days grew shorter, and the work became more challenging. Sarah bundled up in extra layers and continued her routines, determined not to let the harsh weather slow her progress toward her goals. She had no idea that a series of events was about to unfold that would change everything about her life on the base, and finally bring Morrison's behavior into the spotlight where it belonged. The morning started like any other for Sarah. She arrived at the base before dawn, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid Alaskan air. The security guards at the gate knew her well and waved her through with friendly smiles. Sarah parked her old Honda Civic in the civilian lot and gathered her supplies from the trunk. Her cleaning cart squeaked slightly as she wheeled it toward the main administrative building. Today was different, though. 3 high-ranking officials were scheduled to arrive for an important inspection. Sarah had heard the buzz around the base for weeks. Generals Robert Chen, Michael Davidson, and Maria Santos were coming to evaluate the base's readiness and efficiency. These weren't ordinary visitors. They were among the most respected leaders in the entire military, known for their integrity and high standards. Colonel Williams had been preparing for months. Every department had been working overtime to ensure everything was perfect. Sarah had noticed the increased activity and had made sure her own work areas were spotless. She took extra pride in her duties when important visitors came to the base, knowing that her work reflected on the entire facility. General Chen was a legend in military circles. He had served with distinction in multiple conflicts and was known for his fairness and attention to detail. General Davidson had a reputation for being tough but fair, someone who valued character over connections. General Santos was the highest-ranking Latina officer in the military and had broken numerous barriers throughout her career. Together, they formed an inspection team that could make or break careers. Morrison had been particularly aggressive in the days leading up to the inspection. He seemed determined to find fault with everyone and everything. Sarah had watched him berate a young soldier for having a wrinkled uniform and seen him reduce a kitchen worker to tears over a minor issue with food presentation. His stress about the inspection was making his already difficult personality even worse. The night before the generals arrived, Morrison cornered Sarah in the supply closet. His face was red with anger, and she could smell alcohol on his breath. He accused her of leaving streaks on the windows in his office and demanded that she clean them again immediately. Sarah looked at the windows. They were perfectly clean, sparkling in the fluorescent light. She had cleaned them twice that day already. When Sarah politely pointed out that the windows appeared to be clean, Morrison exploded. He grabbed her roughly by the arm and shoved her toward the window. His grip was tight enough to leave bruises, and Sarah winced in pain. Morrison's voice was loud and threatening as he told her she was worthless and should be grateful to have any job at all. He said she was nothing but a janitor who would never amount to anything. Morrison's tirade continued for several minutes. He made cruel comments about her background, her appearance, and her intelligence. He said that people like her didn't belong on military bases, and that she was an embarrassment to everyone who worked there. Sarah stood quietly, trying not to cry, waiting for the storm to pass. She had learned that arguing with Morrison only made things worse. Unknown to both Sarah and Morrison, General Chen had arrived early and was conducting an informal walkthrough of the facility. He wanted to see the base as it really was, not the polished version prepared for official inspections. Chen believed that the true character of a military installation could be found in the details that people thought no one important would notice. Chen was walking through the administrative building when he heard raised voices coming from the supply area. Military bases were usually quiet and professional environments, so the sound of someone shouting immediately caught his attention. As a general with over 30 years of experience, Chen had developed a keen instinct for detecting problems and inappropriate behavior. Moving quietly toward the source of the noise, Chen positioned himself where he could hear clearly without being seen. What he heard made his blood boil. Morrison's voice was filled with venom as he continued his verbal assault on Sarah. The general listened in, shocked silence as the lieutenant colonel used language and behavior that violated every principle of military, leadership, and human decency. Chen heard Morrison threaten Sarah's job, make inappropriate comments about her personal life, and use language that would have resulted in immediate disciplinary action in any proper military environment. Most disturbing was the obvious power imbalance. Morrison was using his rank and authority to bully someone who had no way to defend herself or fight back. Sarah finally spoke up, her voice shaking but determined. She reminded Morrison that she had always done her job well and had never received any legitimate complaints about her work. She said she would clean the windows again if he wanted, but she didn't understand why he was treating her so badly. Her words were respectful but showed a strength that impressed the hidden general. Morrison's response was even worse. He moved closer to Sarah, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. He told her that she should keep her mouth shut and remember her place. He said that if she didn't like how he treated her, she could find another job, but no one would believe her word against his. The threat was clear and unmistakable. General Chen had heard enough. As someone who had dedicated his life to military service and the values it represented, he was disgusted by Morrison's behavior. The military was supposed to be a place where hard work and character mattered more than social status or family connections. What he had witnessed was a complete betrayal of everything the uniform was supposed to represent. The general quietly backed away from the supply area and immediately called his aide. He needed to gather more information about this situation before taking action. Chen was methodical and thorough. He wouldn't move forward based on one incident alone, no matter how disturbing it was. He wanted to understand the full scope of the problem and make sure his response was appropriate and effective. Sarah finally escaped from Morrison's verbal assault and hurried to the nearest bathroom. She locked herself in a stall and allowed the tears to flow freely. Her arm was sore where Morrison had grabbed her, and her hands were shaking from the encounter. She felt humiliated and helpless, wondering if she should just quit and find work somewhere else. After a few minutes, Sarah composed herself and returned to work. She couldn't afford to lose this job despite Morrison's treatment. She had bills to pay and dreams to chase. As she pushed her cart down the hallway, she had no idea that her situation was about to change dramatically. General Chen was already making phone calls and setting wheels in motion that would expose Morrison's behavior and bring justice to Fort Richardson. General Chen spent the rest of the evening making discreet inquiries about Lieutenant Colonel Morrison and the civilian contractor he had witnessed being abused. His aide, Major Patricia Reeves, was skilled at gathering information without raising suspicions. Chen had learned over his decades of service that one incident often revealed much larger problems that needed to be addressed systematically. Major Reeves spoke with several base personnel, asking casual questions about morale and working conditions. The responses painted a disturbing picture. Multiple soldiers mentioned Morrison's harsh treatment of civilian workers. Kitchen staff described incidents where he had made contractors redo perfectly acceptable work. Maintenance personnel shared stories of verbal abuse and unreasonable demands. The pattern was clear and consistent. Morrison had been systematically bullying civilian contractors for months, using his rank and authority to create a hostile work environment. What made it worse was that his behavior seemed to be escalating over time. Recent incidents were more severe than earlier ones, suggesting that Morrison felt emboldened by his apparent immunity from consequences. Sarah arrived home that evening exhausted and emotionally drained. She lived in a small apartment about 20 minutes from the base, sharing the space with her younger sister Maria, who was attending community college. Maria immediately noticed something was wrong when Sarah walked through the door. Her sister's usually bright demeanor was replaced by obvious distress and fatigue. Maria pressed Sarah for details about what had happened. Initially, Sarah tried to brush off the questions, saying she had just had a difficult day at work. But Maria was persistent and caring, and eventually Sarah broke down and told her about Morrison's latest attack. Maria was furious and wanted Sarah to report the incident immediately. But Sarah felt hopeless about the situation. Sarah explained that she had tried to report Morrison's behavior before, but nothing had come of it. The base's complaint process seemed designed to protect officers rather than civilian workers. Morrison's family connections made him virtually untouchable, and Sarah feared that reporting him would only result in losing her job without any consequences for him. Meanwhile, General Chen was meeting with his fellow inspection team members, Generals Davidson and Santos. He briefed them on what he had witnessed and the additional information his aide had gathered. All three generals were veterans with distinguished careers, and they were united in their disgust at Morrison's behavior and the apparent lack of accountability on the base. General Davidson shared that he had received similar reports about Morrison from other bases where the lieutenant colonel had previously served. There seemed to be a pattern of behavior that had been overlooked or covered up due to his family's influence. Davidson had access to Morrison's complete service record and promised to review it thoroughly for any other incidents or complaints. General Santos brought a unique perspective to the discussion. As someone who had faced discrimination and harassment during her own rise through the ranks, she understood personally how damaging such behavior could be. She was particularly concerned about the power imbalance between Morrison and his victims, noting that civilian contractors had even fewer protections than military personnel. The three generals agreed that immediate action was necessary. However, they also understood that they needed to be strategic in their approach. Morrison's family connections meant that any action against him would face scrutiny and potential pushback. They needed to build an airtight case that would withstand any attempts at interference or cover-up. General Chen decided to conduct additional observation before taking formal action. The next morning, he arrived at the base early again, this time accompanied by General Santos. They positioned themselves strategically to observe Morrison's interactions with various personnel throughout the day. They didn't have to wait long to witness more inappropriate behavior. Morrison was inspecting the kitchen facilities when he noticed a small spill on the floor near one of the food preparation areas. Instead of simply pointing it out to the appropriate person, he began screaming at Maria Gonzalez, a civilian contractor responsible for kitchen maintenance. His voice echoed through the entire kitchen as he berated her for what he called unacceptable negligence. Maria Gonzalez was a 52-year-old woman who had been working on military bases for over 15 years. She was known for her reliability and attention to detail. The spill Morrison was screaming about was tiny and had obviously occurred just moments before, probably from normal food preparation activities. Any reasonable person would have simply asked for it to be cleaned up. General Santos watched in horror as Morrison continued his verbal assault. He accused Maria of being lazy and incompetent, suggesting that she didn't care about the safety of military personnel. His language became increasingly personal and cruel, attacking not just her work but her character and intelligence. Maria stood silently, clearly humiliated but unable to defend herself. The other kitchen workers stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or continue with their duties. Several of them exchanged worried glances, obviously familiar with Morrison's explosive temper. The entire atmosphere in the kitchen had become tense and uncomfortable, affecting everyone present. General Chen stepped forward and introduced himself to Morrison. The lieutenant colonel's demeanor changed instantly when he realized he was in the presence of such high-ranking officers. He attempted to justify his behavior by claiming he was maintaining high standards for the upcoming inspection, but his explanations sounded hollow and unconvincing. Chen asked Morrison to accompany him for a private discussion about base operations. As they walked away, General Santos approached Maria Gonzalez and the other kitchen workers. She spoke with them quietly, asking about their experiences and working conditions. The response was immediate and revealing, story after story of Morrison's abusive behavior toward civilian personnel. During his conversation with Morrison, General Chen carefully questioned the lieutenant colonel about his leadership philosophy and treatment of subordinates. Morrison's responses revealed an alarming lack of empathy and understanding of proper military leadership. He seemed to view civilian contractors as disposable resources rather than valued team members. Morrison made several comments that exposed his elitist attitudes and disregard for people he considered beneath his social status. He complained about having to work with low-class civilians and suggested that the military would be better off without them. His words confirmed everything Chen had observed and heard about his character. The general also noticed that Morrison showed no remorse or recognition that his behavior might be inappropriate. Instead, he seemed to believe that his actions were justified and necessary. This lack of self-awareness made Chen realize that Morrison was unlikely to change his behavior without significant consequences. By the end of the day, Generals Chen, Davidson, and Santos had gathered overwhelming evidence of Morrison's pattern of abuse and misconduct. They had witnessed multiple incidents firsthand and collected testimony from numerous victims and witnesses. The case against Morrison was becoming stronger by the hour, and the generals knew it was time to take decisive action. The next morning brought an unexpected turn of events that would forever change the dynamics at Fort Richardson. Sarah arrived at work to find the base buzzing with unusual activity. Military police vehicles were parked outside the administrative building, and she noticed several officers she didn't recognize moving through the hallways with serious expressions on their faces. General Chen had spent most of the night reviewing military regulations and consulting with the Judge Advocate General's office about the proper procedures for addressing Morrison's conduct. The evidence they had gathered was substantial, but Chen wanted to ensure that every action taken was legally sound and followed proper military protocol to prevent any possibility of the charges being dismissed on technicalities. Colonel Williams was summoned to an emergency meeting with the 3 visiting generals at 7 in the morning. She had no idea what to expect but prepared herself for the worst. Williams had always prided herself on running a tight ship, and the thought that something might have escaped her attention was deeply troubling. When Williams entered the conference room, she was surprised by the serious expressions on the generals' faces. General Chen took the lead in explaining what they had discovered about Morrison's behavior toward civilian contractors. As the details unfolded, Williams felt a mixture of shock, anger, and disappointment. She had suspected that Morrison might be difficult to work with, but she had never imagined the extent of his abuse. Williams immediately offered her full cooperation in addressing the situation. She explained that she had received some vague complaints about Morrison's treatment of civilian workers, but nothing specific enough to warrant formal action. She admitted that she might have been too willing to give Morrison the benefit of the doubt due to his family connections and her own busy schedule. The colonel was particularly disturbed to learn about Morrison's treatment of Sarah Martinez. Williams remembered their conversation about Sarah's father's service and her goals for nursing school. The thought that this dedicated young woman had been suffering abuse while Williams remained unaware made her feel like she had failed in her duty as a commander. General Santos outlined the immediate steps that needed to be taken. Morrison would be relieved of his duties pending a full investigation. All civilian contractors who had been subjected to his abuse would be interviewed by military investigators. The base's policies and procedures for handling complaints against officers would be reviewed and strengthened. Meanwhile, Morrison was conducting his morning routine, completely unaware that his world was about to come crashing down. He had breakfast in the officers' mess, joking with other lieutenants about the stress of the inspection. In his mind, he had successfully maintained high standards during the general's visit and expected to receive positive feedback about his performance, and Sarah was cleaning the windows in the main lobby when she saw Morrison walking confidently down the hallway toward his office. Her stomach tightened with anxiety, remembering their encounter in the supply closet. She tried to make herself invisible, focusing intently on her work and hoping to avoid any interaction with him. At exactly 9 o'clock, 2 military police officers appeared at Morrison's office door, with orders to escort him to Colonel Williams's office immediately. Morrison was confused and slightly annoyed by the interruption, but he followed the MPs without resistance. He assumed it was some routine matter related to the ongoing inspection. When Morrison entered Williams's office, he was shocked to find the 3 visiting generals waiting for him. General Chen stood up and formally announced that Morrison was being relieved of his duties effective immediately pending investigation into serious allegations of misconduct and abuse of authority. The color drained from Morrison's face as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Morrison's first instinct was to deny everything and invoke his family connections. He demanded to know who had made accusations against him and threatened to contact his father about what he called a witch hunt against him. His arrogant response only confirmed the general's assessment of his character and lack of remorse for his actions. General Davidson calmly explained that multiple witnesses had come forward with detailed accounts of Morrison's abuse toward civilian contractors. The evidence included first-hand observations by senior officers and extensive testimony from victims and witnesses. Morrison's denials became increasingly desperate as he realized the seriousness of his situation. News of Morrison's removal spread quickly through the base. Sarah heard about it from her supervisor, who seemed genuinely happy that the abusive officer was finally facing consequences. For the first time in months, Sarah felt a sense of relief and hope. Maybe the military justice system could work after all, even against someone with powerful family connections. Later that morning, Sarah was approached by Major Reeves, who identified herself as an aide to General Chen. Major Reeves explained that Sarah and other civilian contractors would be interviewed as part of the formal investigation into Morrison's conduct. She assured Sarah that her cooperation would be protected and that there would be no retaliation for providing honest testimony. Sarah was nervous about being interviewed, but Major Reeves put her at ease with her professional and compassionate demeanor. The Major explained that the generals were committed to ensuring that all base personnel, regardless of rank or status, were treated with dignity and respect. She emphasized that civilian contractors were valued members of the base community who deserved protection from abuse. The interview process was thorough, but respectful. Sarah provided detailed accounts of Morrison's verbal abuse, physical intimidation, and threats. She also shared information about other incidents she had witnessed involving different civilian workers. Major Reeves took careful notes and asked clarifying questions that helped build a comprehensive picture of Morrison's pattern of behavior. Other civilian contractors were also interviewed throughout the day. Maria Gonzalez provided testimony about the kitchen incident the generals had witnessed, as well as several previous encounters with Morrison. Kitchen workers, maintenance staff, and cleaning personnel all shared similar stories of abuse and intimidation. The consistency of the testimony was overwhelming. Every person interviewed described the same pattern of behavior: Morrison using his rank and authority to bully and humiliate civilian workers. The accumulated evidence painted a clear picture of systematic abuse that had been ongoing for months. By the end of the day, the investigators had collected statements from more than 20 witnesses. The evidence was so substantial that even Morrison's family connections would be unable to protect him from serious consequences. The military justice system was finally working as it was supposed to, holding officers accountable for their actions regardless of their background or connections. Sarah left work that day feeling lighter than she had in months. The fear and anxiety that had become constant companions were beginning to fade. She could hardly believe that someone had finally listened to her concerns and taken action to address Morrison's behavior. For the first time since starting work at the base, she felt truly valued and protected. The investigation into Morrison's conduct moved swiftly and thoroughly. General Chen had assigned a team of experienced military investigators to handle the case, ensuring that every aspect of Morrison's behavior was examined carefully. The team included specialists in military justice, personnel management, and victim advocacy to ensure a comprehensive and fair process. Within 48 hours of Morrison's removal, the investigators had compiled a detailed report documenting dozens of incidents spanning the entire duration of his assignment to Fort Richardson. The pattern of abuse was so extensive and well documented that even Morrison's military defense counsel advised him to consider a plea agreement rather than fighting the charges. Morrison's father, retired General Harrison Morrison, arrived at the base 3 days after his son's removal. The elder Morrison was accustomed to using his influence to solve his son's problems, but he quickly discovered that this situation was different. The 3 investigating generals were beyond his reach, and the evidence against his son was overwhelming and undeniable. Sarah watched from a distance as the elder Morrison met with base officials. She could see the family resemblance, the same arrogant bearing and entitled expression that she had come to know so well. However, she also noticed something different in the older man's demeanor as he left the meetings. His confident stride had been replaced by a defeated shuffle. The formal charges against Lieutenant Colonel Morrison were announced on Friday afternoon. He faced multiple counts of conduct unbecoming an officer, abuse of authority, harassment, and violation of regulations governing the treatment of civilian personnel. Each charge carried serious penalties, including possible dismissal from the military and loss of pension benefits. Colonel Williams called a base-wide assembly to address the situation publicly. She stood before hundreds of military and civilian personnel and acknowledged that the command had failed to protect civilian contractors from abuse. Williams took full responsibility for the oversight and announced comprehensive changes to base policies and procedures. The colonel's speech was emotional and heartfelt. She spoke directly to the civilian contractors, acknowledging their essential contributions to base operations and apologizing for the treatment they had endured. Williams promised that such abuse would never be tolerated again and outlined specific steps being taken to prevent future incidents. Sarah was moved by Williams's words and her obvious sincerity. The colonel had personally sought her out after the assembly to apologize privately and to thank her for her courage in providing testimony. Williams also shared some surprising news. Sarah's dedication and character had not gone unnoticed by the visiting generals. General Santos had been particularly impressed by Sarah's professionalism and resilience in the face of Morrison's abuse. The general had made inquiries about Sarah's background and career goals, learning about her plans to attend nursing school. Santos had connections in the military medical community and wanted to help Sarah achieve her dreams. The general arranged for Sarah to meet with the chief medical officer at the base hospital. Commander Jennifer Walsh was a nurse practitioner who had served in military hospitals around the world. She was impressed by Sarah's knowledge and passion for healthcare, as well as her experience caring for military personnel in her civilian role. Commander Walsh offered Sarah an opportunity that seemed too good to be true. The military was always looking for dedicated individuals to join their medical corps, and Sarah's background made her an ideal candidate. The Navy had programs that would pay for her nursing education in exchange for a commitment to serve as a military nurse after graduation. Sarah was overwhelmed by the offer. She had always admired military nurses like her grandmother, but she had never imagined that such a path might be available to her. The program would not only pay for her education, but also provide her with valuable experience in military medicine and the opportunity to serve her country. The base community rallied around Sarah and the other civilian contractors who had suffered under Morrison's abuse. Donations poured in to support Sarah's education goals, and several officers volunteered to provide tutoring and mentorship. The response demonstrated the true character of the military community when leadership failures were corrected. Morrison's court-martial proceeded quickly due to his decision to accept a plea agreement. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of a lengthy prison sentence, he agreed to plead guilty to the charges in exchange for a somewhat reduced penalty. He was sentenced to dismissal from the military, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and 6 months of confinement. The sentence sent a clear message throughout the military that abuse of authority would not be tolerated, regardless of family connections or social status. Morrison's dismissal was particularly significant because it meant the loss of all military benefits and a permanent mark on his record that would follow him for the rest of his life. Sarah attended the sentencing hearing, wanting to see justice served for herself and her fellow contractors. When Morrison was led away in handcuffs, she felt a sense of closure that she had never expected to experience. The man who had made her life miserable was finally being held accountable for his actions. The changes implemented at Fort Richardson became a model for other military installations. Colonel Williams worked with the visiting generals to develop new protocols for protecting civilian contractors and ensuring that complaints of abuse were properly investigated. The base established an ombudsman position specifically to advocate for civilian workers. Sarah's story spread throughout the military community, inspiring other victims of abuse to come forward and seek justice. Her courage in providing testimony against Morrison, despite the risks to her job and future, became an example of how ordinary people could stand up to institutional power when supported by principled leadership. The transformation at Fort Richardson was remarkable. The atmosphere of fear and intimidation that Morrison had created was replaced by a culture of mutual respect and professionalism. Civilian contractors no longer worked in fear of arbitrary punishment or verbal abuse. Morale improved dramatically across all departments. Sarah's relationship with the base community also changed significantly. She was no longer invisible or taken for granted. Officers and enlisted personnel alike treated her with the respect she had always deserved. Her work was recognized and valued, and she felt like a true member of the team rather than just hired help. As Sarah prepared to begin her journey toward becoming a military nurse, she reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few weeks. What had started as the worst period of her employment had transformed into an opportunity beyond her wildest dreams. The abuse she had endured had been terrible, but it had also revealed the best qualities of the military community when proper leadership was in place. 6 months later, Sarah Martinez stood in her crisp Navy uniform outside the nursing school at the University of Alaska. The transformation in her life still felt surreal sometimes. The young woman who had once scrubbed floors while dreaming of a better future was now Seaman Recruit Martinez, beginning her journey to become a commissioned officer in the Navy Nurse Corps. The military scholarship program had exceeded all her expectations. Not only did it cover her full tuition and living expenses, but it also provided her with hands-on experience at the base hospital. Sarah worked part-time as a hospital corpsman while attending classes, gaining practical medical experience that would make her a better nurse when she graduated. Commander Walsh had become both a mentor and friend to Sarah. The experienced nurse practitioner took personal interest in Sarah's development, providing guidance on everything from medical procedures to military protocol. Under Walsh's supervision, Sarah learned to start IVs, assist with minor surgeries, and provide compassionate care to wounded soldiers returning from deployments. The base hospital had become Sarah's second home. She loved the fast-paced environment and the opportunity to make a real difference in people's lives. Working with injured and sick military personnel reminded her daily of her father's service and her grandmother's legacy. She felt connected to something larger than herself. General Santos had kept in touch with Sarah throughout her transition into military service. The general made it a point to check on Sarah's progress whenever she visited Fort Richardson for official business. Santos saw Sarah as proof that the military justice system could work when principled leaders were willing to take action against wrongdoing. The changes at Fort Richardson had indeed become a model for other installations across the military. Colonel Williams had been promoted and assigned to implement similar reforms at bases throughout the Pacific region. Her work in transforming the culture at Fort Richardson had earned recognition from the highest levels of military leadership. Morrison's dismissal had sent shockwaves through the military community, particularly among officers who had previously felt protected by family connections or social status. The case became a powerful example that character and conduct mattered more than background or influence. Several other officers facing similar charges had been encouraged to accept plea agreements rather than risk the same fate as Morrison. Sarah often thought about Morrison's victims who had suffered in silence before the 3 generals arrived. Maria Gonzalez had received a commendation for her years of dedicated service and a promotion to supervisor of kitchen operations. Other civilian contractors had been recognized and rewarded for their contributions to base operations. The civilian contractor workforce at Fort Richardson had grown and become more professional since the implementation of new policies. The base now actively recruited skilled civilians and provided them with career development opportunities. The relationship between military and civilian personnel had been transformed from one of hierarchy and potential abuse to one of mutual respect and collaboration. Sarah's sister Maria had been inspired by her older sister's transformation and had decided to pursue her own military career. She was preparing to enlist in the Air Force with plans to study aerospace engineering. The sisters supported each other's ambitions and often talked about serving together in different branches of the military. During her clinical rotations, Sarah encountered wounded veterans who reminded her of her father. She worked with soldiers who had lost limbs in combat, others dealing with traumatic brain injuries, and many struggling with psychological wounds from their service. These experiences deepened her commitment to military medicine and her understanding of the sacrifices made by service members. Sarah's nursing school professors were impressed by her maturity and practical experience. While her classmates were learning basic medical procedures for the first time, Sarah already had hands-on experience from her work at the base hospital. Her unique background as both a civilian, contractor, and active duty service member gave her perspectives that enriched class discussions. The three generals who had changed. Sarah's life continued their distinguished careers, but they never forgot the lessons learned at Fort Richardson. General Chen used the case in leadership training programs, emphasizing the importance of protecting vulnerable personnel regardless of their rank or status. The generals had proven that doing the right thing was more important than avoiding conflict or protecting institutional interests. Fort Richardson had become known throughout the military as an example of positive command climate and effective leadership. Young officers requested assignments there specifically to learn from Colonel Williams and her successors. The base's reputation for treating all personnel with dignity and respect attracted high-quality military and civilian workers. Sarah's transformation had ripple effects throughout her community. Her success story inspired other young people from military families to consider careers in military service. She spoke at high schools and community colleges about the opportunities available in the military, particularly for those interested in healthcare careers. As Sarah prepared for her final exams before graduating from nursing school, she received a surprise visit from General Santos. The general was in Alaska for an official visit and had made time to check on Sarah's progress. Santos was pleased to learn that Sarah would graduate at the top of her class and had been selected for a competitive residency program in trauma nursing. The general shared news that brought Sarah's journey full circle. Morrison had struggled to find employment after his dismissal from the military. His military record and the circumstances of his discharge made him unemployable in most fields, requiring security clearances or positions of trust. The consequences of his actions continued to follow him long after his brief period of confinement ended. Sarah felt no satisfaction in Morrison's continued struggles. She had learned that true justice was not about revenge, but about preventing future victims and creating positive change. Her focus was on the future she was building rather than the past she had overcome. On graduation day, Sarah stood proudly as she received her nursing degree and her commission as an ensign in the Navy Nurse Corps. Her mother and sister were in the audience, along with Commander Walsh, Colonel Williams, and several of her former colleagues from the cleaning crew who had become close friends. General Santos delivered the keynote address at the graduation ceremony. She spoke about courage, integrity, and the importance of standing up for what is right even when it seems impossible. Though she didn't mention Sarah by name, everyone in the audience understood that her words were inspired by the young woman who had transformed from a janitor to a commissioned officer through perseverance and the support of principled leaders. As Ensign Martinez walked across the stage to receive her diploma, she thought about her father and grandmother who had inspired her military service. She thought about the three generals who had seen her worth when others overlooked her. Most of all, she thought about the future ahead of her and the wounded warriors she would soon serve as a Navy nurse. The little girl who had dreamed of following in her grandmother's footsteps had finally achieved her goal. But the journey had taught her that sometimes the worst experiences in life can lead to the most extraordinary opportunities when good people have the courage to do what is right.